Death of a Game, Vanguard, Saga of Heroes. From one of the creators of EverQuest came Vanguard, Saga of Heroes, a high fantasy MMO meant to recapture the original magic behind EverQuest 1 and serve as a spiritual successor of sorts. It was developed by none other than Brad McQuaid and a couple other key members of the previous Varen Interactive. That's an awful large burden for a game developed by an independent studio such as Sigil Games, the company created by Brad McQuaid and Jeff Butler. Still, it had quite the buzz initially and was on its trajectory to become a successful title, especially with such influential developers behind it. But like most of my videos in this series, at some point, a wheel falls off the wagon and the wagon comes crashing to a stop. And in this episode of Death of a Game, we will take a look at the largest contributing factors in the death of Vanguard, Saga of Heroes.
It is rumored amongst the most intelligent races of NORAD that first came the dragons.
No one can deny EverQuest's success. As a title that launched in 1999, its influence is still spread across today's market, most notably in the form of World of Warcraft, which really took everything that EverQuest did and did it more efficient and made it easier to access. When people think EverQuest, they think SOE, and by association, John Smedley is the name that comes to mind, a name that summons anger in just about all fanboys of early MMOs. But Smedley wasn't the only one involved in EverQuest. Brad McQuaid was credited as the lead designer on the project. These two served pivotal roles at Varen Interactive, which was later acquired by SOE. Although Smedley is credited for the concept of EverQuest, Brad was credited for the design of the title. Brad, however, was no longer involved in the design aspects of future SOE subscription-based games, most notably the sequel to EverQuest 1, EverQuest 2. This was a point of contention for Brad, as he didn't like how hands-off his approach had become while at SOE, with titles such as Star Wars Galaxies, and of course the sequel to his child of a project, EverQuest. Brad wanted to be more hands-on again, and involved in the creative process, so when he had the opportunity to leave SOE gracefully, he did so in October 2001. Brad also didn't believe staying with SOE and making a new MMO would be the right move, because as Brad put it, he felt that SOE and EverQuest 2 could be competition. Brad McQuaid and Jeff Butler formed Sigil Games Online in January of 2002. They were focused on one title. In order to secure funding for the project, Brad exhausted some of his connections, most notably a group of friends and acquaintances he had met at Microsoft Games. Brad chose Microsoft as Microsoft did not have an MMO title, and Jeff and him really figured if any company could compete with Blizzard's World of Warcraft or SOE's EverQuest 2, it was the deep pockets behind Microsoft. The relationship with Microsoft would never be realized, however. Microsoft was expecting a launch of Vanguard in 2006, and the game wasn't really ready yet. Sigil Games orchestrated a repurchase of the rights for their title Vanguard Saga of Heroes, and announced that they would be co-publishing the title with SOE. As the development process is ongoing and constantly shifting, it became clear that MGS, Microsoft Game Studios, and Sigil had varying visions and directions for the title's development, said Brad McQuaid in an interview. In the best interest of Vanguard, it was decided that we would buy the publishing rights back from Microsoft. So Brad would be returning to SOE. They always come back. We are very excited to be working with so many old friends at Sigil, said John Smedley. Vanguard looks beautiful and has an incredibly rich game world. It's the type of game that will appeal directly to the SOE's hundreds of thousands of players and should fit in perfectly with the current lineup of games available in the Station Access. Following this news came a showing of Vanguard Saga of Heroes at E3 in 2006. From the sounds of it, Vanguard was impressing the critics. It boasted a robust crafting system, character creator that had outside investors also interested in, and a weather system, deep lore, and player housing much similar to what SWG was able to implement as well. All of this not being instanced, being set in a massive open world. By this point in time, World of Warcraft had already been out for about 2 years and was shaping up to be the juggernaut we all know it to be today. Still, Vanguard had quite positive press, and many people, including fans of Brad and EverQuest, were excitedly awaiting its launch. Vanguard Saga of Heroes launched January 30th, 2007, 5 years after the start of its development. The reaction to the launch, however, not very close to the previous expectations. Critics gave the game an aggregate score of 68 out of 100, and major critics like GameSpy said, "There's potential for a very good game here, and we've had our share of both highs and lows with the gameplay, but the sheer amount of gameplay bugs, graphical issues, and poor technical performance make it difficult to recommend in its current state." Game Informer was a bit more positive, but not by much. If a slower-paced, more complex title in the vein of EverQuest is what you're looking for, then Vanguard will serve you well. A lack of polish in several areas and strong competition keep this game from being particularly special though. The game was plagued with performance issues, server issues, and regardless of how good your PC was, the game just seemed to not really run well. According to Brad himself, the game sold around 250,000 units quite quickly, which was slightly positive news. But in response to a poor launch overall, on May 15, 2007, Sony acquired all assets of Vanguard Saga of Heroes and retained over half of the developers to continue to work on Vanguard. It was also at this time that Brad took a back seat on all of things Vanguard and SOE. Sure, a few days after the purchase of his company, he spoke briefly on F13.net, but after that was virtually silent. Brad, in the previously mentioned interview, stated that his backseat stance was due to him focusing more on finding potential investors and funding to keep Vanguard alive. But did SOE just want to put a muzzle on Brad? Did they just want to have him around just for his name recognition and possible ideas every now and then? Or did Brad just accept that a game that he had risked so much on wasn't panning out to be how he wanted it to be? It was unclear at the time, as Sony's cryptic press release made it seem that Brad was still involved, but not really involved. Turns out, he resigned and SOE just kept him on as a creative consultant of sorts, which is usually where they put the crazy creative guy who's made too many bad business decisions. No offense, but it's not like the first time this stereotype has existed. August 2007, there were already servers being merged. This unfortunately meant that Vanguard was losing both its roleplay and PvP server. From the period of launch till about 2009, there were a few changes to the game, mostly revolving around bug fixing and performance fixing. Isle of Dawn was introduced in Game Update 6 on September 10, 2008. This update also introduced some minor graphical updates and more bug fixes. As 2009 came to an end, fans of Vanguard, or what was left of them, were happy that there were some major changes still planned to the game. Well, they were supposed to be. Due to limited resources and a new focus on bug elimination over ambitious content releases, some of the game's anticipated updates are being shelved indefinitely. Those features include the Halls of the Shattered Souls, Pancor Xi, Nexus, and the anticipated alternate advancement system. March 12, 2009 saw the implementation of RMT, real money trading in Vanguard. RMT had previously hit EverQuest 2, and fans weren't really happy about it there either. Still, most could live with the fact that RMT was kept on a separate server. This allowed the trading of items, game currency, and even playable characters for real currency, real-life currency. Later that summer, the 3 remaining servers were merged to one, leaving one last US server to stand. At this point, as I was told by fans of Vanguard, Vanguard was really only surviving because of the Station Pass, which was a monthly subscription that allowed you to play multiple Sony games that required subscriptions. This was the only way that I personally ever got to try the game. March 21st, 2012, Vanguard, like most failing MMOs at the time, went free to play. To help SOE implement this, they brought back Brad to help facilitate this. But unlike some of its competitors in the market, say Lotro or City of Heroes, the free-to-play change wasn't enough to bring success to Vanguard, and the title was finally brought down on July 31st, 2014. A group of die-hard fans, however, were not willing to call it quits yet. Vanguard Emulator was a fan-made project to bring Vanguard back online. Its emulator currently, as of 2017, isn't completely playable yet, but you can create a character on it and even participate in some of the basic crafting and diplomacy in the game. The progress on the emulator has understandably been slow, but if you want a chance to feel the undeniable charm that Vanguard had once, I would give the emulator a try. So what happened to Brad McQuaid after Vanguard's death? Where did Brad go? Well, he actually returned to SOE full-time to help work on EverQuest. In what capacity? We don't really know, but I wouldn't put it past SOE for wanting to just keep him on a leash, lest he go off and create another competing game, which is exactly what he did on January 13th, 2014, through the Kickstarter platform initially. Brad announced his new title, Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen, which was quite metaphoric in its name.
Hi there, I'm Brad McQuaid, Chief Creative Officer of Visionary Realms, and also one of the producers of Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen. We're here on Kickstarter to ask you for help in the creation of a new MMO. It's a huge open world to explore. It has an emphasis on grouping and working together, making friends. And we also have this really neat combat system that we're putting together that's deeper and hopefully a lot more fun than what you've seen in other MMOs. Our vision for the game is group focused. We feel that when people are working together as a team, that they can accomplish a lot more and feel a lot better afterwards. We also have a combat system that's very involved, it's reactive. You can actually respond to what an NPC is doing to you. We're making a challenging game for players who like to group, who like to work together as a team. We really feel that when you do work together as a team, that the sense of accomplishment you get is something that's truly memorable.
Can't say that any of that sounds different than Vanguard did a decade ago, but Brad promises to do the things right this time, and some of us probably believe him. The Kickstarter failed to reach its funding goal of $800,000 by around $500,000, but that didn't stop Brad and his new company, Visionary Realms, from continuing their goal of Pantheon. They put the crowdfunding directly on their website for people to pledge in varying amounts with varying rewards. The game won't launch as of 2017 yet, but promises to have a playable beta at the very least by the end of the year. So although Vanguard in its original implementation ceases to exist, it has a player-run emulator running as well as a spiritual successor to the spiritual successor of EverQuest. That's a lot of spiritual successors, but Pantheon certainly looks more playable than Vanguard was in its early phases. It's still quite impressive though that Vanguard was able to live for 7 years after its launch. Unlike some of the other SOE stablemates, say Star Wars Galaxies or EverQuest, those games were considered successful in their earlier implementations, whereas Vanguard was widely considered a failure at launch. That speaks to the charm of the game and could likely be, as Brad put himself, the game having too grand of a vision for both its budget and engine at the time. So why did Vanguard fail? Let's outline the largest contributing factors in the death of Vanguard Saga of Heroes. But first, let's take a few minutes to talk about the legacy Vanguard had on the video game world. Learning the legacy of something provides greater context as to why it's important or relevant that the game failed in the first place. Within Vanguard, you had three major features or aspects. Standard PvE, of course, was one of these pillars or spheres, and since the game was an instance, dungeons were more open. PvE felt more daring and explorative by nature. And when I say standard PvE, I mean just it's more recognizable maybe than some of the other aspects. PvE in Vanguard was not really standard though, it was tough. There were strict death penalties much like EverQuest, and because every class brought something unique, PvE was a lot more tactical. Crafting was another major sphere, or feature of the game, which was its own mini-game and playstyle. It had quest, experience, and leveling. Crafting in the game, especially the in-game, was extremely relevant. Sure, it was a little bit grindy compared to, say, diplomacy, but it still was its own sphere. The third and last feature of the three spheres, which in my opinion was likely Vanguard's most unique, was diplomacy. Diplomacy was essentially a card game, but also the main source of lore in the game. Like crafting, it had its own leveling and progression system, and also like crafting, it was greatly needed in the endgame. It was unique how Vanguard took these three spheres, intertwined them, and created playstyles that didn't force you to be a combat class or combat playstyle, much like Star Wars Galaxies did. It's almost lazy to say that Vanguard was a fun game and had its charm due to having so many aspects that were similar to EverQuest, but it's kind of true. Vanguard was hailed as the spiritual successor to EverQuest 1, despite EverQuest having its own sequel. That was because Brad, the guy behind EverQuest, or at least one of the major guys behind it, had a different vision than that of EverQuest 2, which attempted to be more like WoW. Vanguard was a true massive multiplayer online game in every sense of the word. It didn't hide behind instances. Vanguard wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers, hence its harsh death penalty and challenging PvE. With 15 classes in the game and nearly a dozen different races with different specializations, lore, and looks to them, characters felt and played unique. You could really get behind your character. You felt like you were role-playing somebody else in another world, something that current MMOs have severely been lacking. Lore is a long-lost love in MMOs, especially because things like adventuring are nearly dead as we knew them. But in Vanguard, because there wasn't instances, exploring really felt like that, exploring. You really felt like as if you traversed the world, you could find things someone else might not have found. You felt like you could create your own character and surely live in the world that Vanguard had created. There's a reason Pantheon, 10 years after Vanguard, and Vanguard 8 years after EverQuest are and were able to generate so much hype and good feelings about them. Despite the MMO market largely becoming more instant as of now, and streamlined to some extent, there is still a group of players and fans who want MMOs to return to what they were initially. MMOs of old were about social interactions. You had to interact with others in the world because everyone's class had some sort of interaction that was helpful to others. And crafting was something that was also needed in the world. People created their settlements, their houses. You had reasons to talk to other people. You had to interact with other people, whether it be for quest grouping or maybe just having someone craft you gear. A lot of that is lost in today's current world of MMOs, but hopefully not for long. Vanguard, and now possibly Pantheon, were the EverQuest average fans' last chance at being able to play a game or a world that they originally loved in EverQuest, with a few more bells and whistles in the case of Vanguard and now Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, and better graphics as well. It might be hard as an outsider looking in to see the charm of Vanguard at first glance, but as a woefully unfinished MMO with innumerable bugs and performance issues, it was still able to survive for almost a decade. Vanguard was special, and it's important to remember that. But let's be honest here, you guys are gluttons for punishment. You love to hear why the mighty fall or why your beloved games are dead and gone. So why did Vanguard Saga of Heroes die? What were the largest contributing factors in the death of Vanguard? Troubled launch. The launch issues of Vanguard are likely the thing that most remembered about the game, especially those who didn't significantly play the game in any way enough to enjoy the charm. It's not exactly a secret that upon its launch, Vanguard had such performance issues that even the top-of-the-line PCs struggled to run the game. Now sure, Brad got a lot of crap when asked if they were launching a finished game, and he responded with, "No, we're launching a game that is good enough to launch, but it's not finished." Now, I want to give Brad the benefit of the doubt here and say that after reading the full context of the quote, he was merely saying that MMOs are constantly worked on, but it was not a very good answer for him to give a reviewer of a game or just the press in general. We know now with certainty, straight from the horse's mouth, that the game was almost at 60% complete and rushed to launch. As Brad put himself, the game wasn't optimized. The client wasn't optimized, the server wasn't optimized. The vast majority of people who played it early on left by the time their characters hit level 2 or 3. We knew that there was a performance issue because you don't know whether you like an MMO by level 2 or 3, right? You stay longer than that. The only thing that would have made you drive away that early on would have been that you couldn't even play the game. Some people stuck with it. They saw the potential, but the majority couldn't play it at a quality level where it was actually fun. Even the lowest settings people had a hard time. Their frame rate was horrible, the latency was bad, and it was just a pain in the butt to play. And to interject myself a little bit here, I actually tried to play the game. As I previously mentioned, I had the Station Pass back when Galaxies was able to be played with that, and I tried Vanguard. I thought it looked interesting. The character creator seemed awesome, and I was really excited to get in and see what this game was all about. Up until I slideshowed all the way through the character creation, or at least after the character creation, I even lagged during the character creator. It wasn't a good sign for things to come, and since my computer at the time wasn't very good, I quit, just like Brad had said about those level 2 and level 3 people in the game. So what were the issues with Vanguard? Why was the game so unfinished, and why did they have so many performance issues? Well, part of that is probably because of the engine that they chose to use, the Unreal Engine 2, which, as many people know about Unreal Engines, they don't exactly perform the best whenever you have a lot of things on screen. But also, as Brad put when interviewed by IGN, while Sigil was working with Microsoft to release Vanguard, there was a change in the regime at Microsoft. and it wasn't a good change. As Brad put in the interview, the new team came along and said, "You guys are late and over budget." We didn't understand it, and it was downhill from there. They clearly didn't want to make an MMO. If they were going to be forced to make an MMO, they wanted it to be as much like World of Warcraft as possible. We weren't really in the mood to change our game like that, and we didn't want to copy another game. It pretty quickly came to a head that they wanted to release Vanguard a year earlier than we believed we needed. That would have been just a complete and utter disaster. Vanguard was in late alpha and in no condition to be released at all. It seemed like Sigil at the time was already out of luck. They were being forced to release Vanguard so early on. But things did look a little bit up whenever SOE helped Sigil resecure the rights to their project and then also was going to co-publish the game. This meant that Microsoft wasn't going to be involved anymore. But SOE was only a temporary solution. When they came into the picture, they told Brad and his team that they could only fund the game for 6 more months and not a year, which is what they were asking for. It was at this point that Brad and team started to panic. They knew that the game would not be ready, but were out of options. It's also at this period that Brad was said to not have been seen much in the office, which he claims was due to him trying to find more money for developing, but fans in retrospect couldn't help but say it was just him not wanting to face the curtains, that the project that he invested so much in was going to be dead on arrival. The rocky last couple of months for Vanguard and its development team clearly affected the launch of the game and in turn the success of Vanguard. Even though Vanguard could nearly sell 300,000 copies just out the gate, when an MMO can't retain its population right after launch, it's an uphill battle to try and regain players. Players can be unforgiving when it comes to games that launch unfinished, especially MMO players. And when you're already starting from a deficit, you have this $30 million budget that you're trying to repay, and then now you have this other company come in and take rights of the game, and you're trying to help them out now, and they expect a return on their investment. You're fighting from a deficit, and fighting from a deficit, especially as an MMO, which are very costly, can mark a death of a game. The rug pulled out from underneath. Now that's a bit cheesy of a statement, but none more apt in the case of Vanguard. When Brad McQuaid and Jim Butler wanted to create Vanguard, they needed serious backing, especially when they needed to compete with Blizzard with their World of Warcraft and his previous SOE and their EverQuest 2. Brad thought that there was no better publisher than Microsoft, who has yet to be involved in the MMO market and had seriously deep pockets. This seemed like a good decision early on, but took a turn for the worse when nearly the entire team behind Microsoft's gaming division was gutted and replaced. We were working with Ed Fries and his group, and he was in charge of the games at Microsoft. They were fantastic. We became friends with these guys, and we had the same vision. Something happened though. I'm not privy to it, but Ed Fries left Microsoft, and so did just about everybody else who worked for him, and who we interacted with. This meant that there was a new regime at Microsoft. They had their own desires and ideas of what success was. They assigned Sigil and Brad's team to a team that had worked on the Zoo Tycoon title, which was not exactly someone with MMO experience or even anything close to the same experience. This probably attributed to Microsoft losing interest in creating an MMO title in the first place, especially when, as Brad mentioned in the IGN interview, Sigil started to realize that their $30 to $40 million budget was minuscule when compared to their competitors. But Microsoft accused Brad and his team of already being over budget, and were forcing them to launch the game likely because of them not wanting to fund the game any longer. The rug was pulled from underneath Brad and his team. With little options, they were forced to go back with SOE, who weren't exactly prepared to give them the time that they needed anyway. If this story starts to sound like Brad and his team were just unlucky and the fate of Vanguard was based on circumstances out of control, I understand why you would think that, but in a few minutes, I will attempt to change that thought. I have made it abundantly clear in other videos, I don't like to point fingers and blame people blindly. I don't think it's conducive to learning, and I certainly don't think it's the right way to logically analyze something. Not to mention, you can't paint somebody a certain way for the rest of eternity because people can grow and change. I especially dislike people who won't take fault for their mistakes, however. For example, anytime SOE is involved in the development of a game, there is a tiring meme where people, when asked why the game failed, will just say, SOE happened. But that's not really a fair meme to carry on, especially when you have to consider that in most cases, SOE merely serves as a publisher to development teams, and dev teams still have some level of control over their game. In the case of Brad and his Vanguard title, I couldn't help but notice a pattern when doing my research. I have scoured quite a few interviews, videos, and have read an awful lot from Brad McQuaid, and why he thought Vanguard failed, and just his thoughts on other things. One thing I couldn't help but shake is he never seemed to take fault for the game itself. Brad always had an answer, or as I would call it, an excuse as to why something happened the way it did. Now, did Microsoft pushing them to release their title after a leadership change hurt Vanguard? Certainly. That's undeniable. But by the point that happened to Sigil, Brad and his squad had already been working on the title for 4 years. 4 years and the title was still in alpha? That doesn't really seem to match up with typical standards of a release schedule. Sure, WoW and Guild Wars 2 took 5 years to develop, but I want to bet that that last year is what most people refer to as the performance or optimization year. From the perspective of an investor, or in this case a publisher, after a certain point you have to expect to start to see a return on your investment. A $30 million investment is a lot of money, though not necessarily as much when compared to other MMOs, say SWTOR, ESO, or World of Warcraft. Still, as the CEO of a company, being in charge of things like managing the project, you can't entirely blame the size of your budget. The job of a CEO or project lead is to make sure that you temper your expectations to match your budget. If I want to build a bicycle and you give $1,000 to me, I know ahead of time where my budget lies, and I have to be very specific in the parts that I want to get, lest I go over my budget. But as expected by most creatives, they don't necessarily have the tools required or have learned the tools required to properly manage a budget. I imagine it being hard when you have this grand vision for a game, you start to chase that vision, forgetting about little pesky things like budgets and dollar amounts along the way. I want to make it abundantly clear. I am not piling on Brad McQuaid. He's certainly an icon in the world of MMOs. But after a certain point, you have to look at the guy in charge and put some blame on him, especially when he certainly didn't want to take any of the blame himself. The scope of Vanguard was absolutely massive, a fully rendered massive world with no instances. But a more controlled title, maybe while not as impressive in scope, probably could have performed better, especially when pressured to release in under 5 years. When things got tough for Sigil and the team, Brad and Jeff weren't anywhere in sight, as reported by Engadget. Following E3 2006, Sigil pushed to get the game into beta, while it was obvious to both Sigil employees and beta testers that Vanguard was far from ready for prime time. The devs ignored the criticism. Matters were worse than most assumed. There was only a single member of quality assurance working on the game through November 2006. McQuaid stopped coming into the office by the time Vanguard was in the second phase of its beta testing, and Jeff Butler disappeared as well, leaving a leadership void during a critical time. So why did Jeff Butler seem to disappear? Well, according to some of the interviews that I've read and sources, he had an affair with one of the other devs on the team. Yes, that's a real thing, almost confirmed by Brad himself in his interview that he did on F13.net. So while Jeff was diddling his coworkers, where was Brad in all of this? According to him, he was trying to secure funding for the project. Unfortunately, there's not really evidence other than his words to confirm this. What we do know with certainty is when Sigil Games was in its biggest time of need, both of its leaders were nowhere in sight. And that's why you have to start to look at Brad and Jeff in this case and assign some of the blame to them. Though the dev team behind Vanguard didn't seem to miss Brad as much as it might seem in an interview F13 did with the next Sigil employee, he stated that most of the office was happy that Brad wasn't present near the end. And what was the attitude by the team towards Brad and Jeff by now? This is the interviewer referring to the period right before the launch of the game. Surely Brad's disappearance absolutely wrecked morale. Ex-Sigil employees said that not really. When he was at work, he was more than an obstacle than a help. A lot of people wanted Brad to go away. The interviewer states that conflicts with a lot of the stories that they had heard about people leaving companies just to join Brad. The ex-Sigil employee replies that a lot of people did. What do people think of Brad now? Let's be real here. Is he even fit to work in the industry? In the last bit, which is quite biting, I think Brad's situation is an odd one. He's got tons of crazy ideas, but he really shouldn't be in charge of anything. He's a great theory crafter, and as long as he's tempered by people, who could determine that that was possible or not? It doesn't help that when Vanguard started to go through its launch issues, that Brad was indirectly blaming the very community who loved the game in the first place. Like I said, That message resonated with a lot of people in a positive way, but it also did harm in those people that didn't want another EQ1, were turned off when they heard about Vanguard, but not all of the details behind the game. There were and are a lot of vanboys who spread the word that the game was not for WoW players and that people who like a more casual game like WoW were not welcome in Vanguard. In that sense, the messaging backfired and many people aren't even giving the game a chance. Yeah, that didn't really do Brad and Vanguard any favors and was more evidence of Brad yet again diverting any blame. In the end, SOE only kept Brad around for his name and some of his ideas, according to the ex-Sigil employee in that previous interview stated on F13.net. So why do you think SOE kept him? His name? I heard he's being paid a minor pittance to have his name associated with the game still, but he won't actually be doing anything. I shouldn't say pittance, since he's likely being paid more than most of the people that were let go. He got his initial investment back, I think, in the buyout, and that's about it. But that's pretty much a rumor. Only those involved know for real. But all I know is that he could have made plenty, or he could have not have gotten a dime, but I seriously doubt that. And this is where my issue with the narrative painted by fans of games, especially SOE games, lies. SOE certainly has had their share of mess-ups, and they're well documented in my SWG video. But when an ex-Sigil dev is stating that he would never want to work with Brad McQuaid in the future because of him being both close-minded and a poor leader, you have to put some stock into that claim. You also have to put some blame on the leader behind the project, before you point fingers at SOE, who's at this point the proverbial boogeyman, especially when Vanguard was already failing before they got to SOE. Is it really SOE's fault that they didn't want to fund the game for 6 more months? You have to realize that that would cost them millions, without a guarantee that they would even get that investment back from Sigil Games. To reinforce my initial point, don't blame single instances for the failure of an MMO. As you can tell from watching my previous episodes, and hopefully this episode, it is never a single issue or single reason that a game dies. That's why I love doing these videos, because every game or company has its own story of trials and tribulations, and it's important to shed light on this. Maybe Brad having a more creative role in his newest title, Pantheon, is the smartest option, as he proved in the past an inability to manage, but also proved an extraordinary ability to create. Let creatives create. Don't let them manage if they have shown an inability to do so in the first place, despite how notable they are as a person, or as accomplished as they might be. Still, people can change and can improve, so I wouldn't be so quick to write off Pantheon, if that's your sort of game, of course. I want to thank you guys for reaching the end of this video. Hopefully after reaching it, you have a better understanding of why Vanguard was both a memorable game and why the game ultimately failed. That's the end of this episode though, and thanks go to those who managed to watch it all the way through. You guys are the best. Nerdslayer, out.